My name is Erik Rönmark. I am the Vice President and General Manager for the Detroit Symphony Orchestra. We have with us today Daniel Bernard Roumain. Uh, he's a composer, performer, educator. I think we met probably a little over 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Back in 2012, the DSO performed your work, Dancers, Dreamers, and Precedents. And I can go into a lot of details about all the things that you're working on and have done
Mm.
over this past decade. But I would just urge everyone to go to danielroumain.com and check it out. There's a lot of interesting things. Welcome.
Hey, thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
So my first question is what are some of the projects that you currently are working on, and you are really busy.
Yeah.
So how do you balance your time?
Oh, well, let's start there. Well, first of all, I'm in Norwood, Massachusetts. I have a townhouse here. This is the land of the Massachusetts and Pawaong people. Wearing a black wool cap, yellow jacket, and behind me in my background it says "Stop AAPI Hate." And I'm saying that for anyone who cannot see as well as I can, and also to give power to place, and to think about balance. Yeah. So one of the things that I'm doing now is I'm thinking about rest as protest. I try to end my day at 8 p.m. Matter of fact, my computer is scheduled to shut off every day at 8 o'clock. Although sometimes I'm performing at night, so that makes it hard. I have an 11-year-old son who is all boy in baseball right now, and is doing really well in school and also doing really well in life. And that requires a lot of work of attention, happily so, happily so. And I'm also thinking about my own health and trying to, eat better and get more rest and exercise more and just be more mindful and present. So that's in many ways is a priority for me, for sure. The other side of it is just time management, and really, I have a couple people to help me with my schedule, and we never take on more projects than we can chew. But it is pretty busy right now. I'm working on two film scores, a song cycle for a small chamber group, two voices and piano quartet. I'm working on music for a television program. We'll see about that. And I'm also working on a new opera for Lyric Opera of Chicago with the great Anna Devere Smith, actress and writer, as the librettist, which is really exciting to be doing that.
Going back to Dancers, Dreamers, and Precedents, was that one of your earliest orchestral works?
I started writing for the orchestra in high school,
Oh wow,
actually.
yeah.
Yeah. I wrote a song for SADD, Students Against Drunk Driving,
Hmm.
SADD. I'm 50, so 30 some odd years ago, 32 years ago. I can't remember what the song was called, but it was for a singer, a kind of rock band, my rock band, and a full orchestra. That's one of the earliest ones. I just
That's great.
figured it out.
Yeah.
And so I had been working, writing chamber music. Well, I started playing violin when I was 5, started composing when I was 10 years old, and started writing for the orchestra and large ensembles. I wrote a musical, all these things by middle school and high school. So by the time I got to college, it's a little unusual. I don't know. By the time I got to college, I was already, I had already written a lot of music, actually.
Hmm.
In high school, I went to performing arts high school, and they had a full orchestra, and as well as a kind of a musical department, Broadway musical department. So I wrote a musical called Gray. In a world of black and white, we are more beautiful as gray. I remember that too. So Dancers, Dreamers, and Presidents, who knows? It's probably by that time my 15th, 20th work. My debut was, I was 21, I think, 2021. It was at that time, it was called the Eastland Oak Bass Symphony. And it was Michael Morgan
Yeah,
who
for sure.
premiered my Haitian essay. Yeah, which was now, gosh, 30 years ago.
Yeah. We did a program, a couple of concerts back in the fall, um, and one theme in those programs was actually the composer as a performer, or the performer as a composer. We had works by Nukatulang Wanyama and Taishan Sori, and Florence Price, all performers and composers. You as a performer and a composer, what are some of your influences that sort of guides your creative space?
Well, I've always been blessed that I've never had writer's block. It's almost like the spigot of on a house
Hmm.
where the water is just constantly coming out. I mean, for me, everything begins with an idea. I refer to myself as, I define myself as a Black Haitian American composer. Both of my parents were born in Haiti, and I take that very seriously. I define composing as the farming and framing of ideas. And I constantly have ideas. The ideas, once I select one, becomes a title. And once I have the title, and that's the hardest part in a lot of ways, once I have that title, that generates everything. That generates the music. Then things can come pretty quickly.
Yeah.
The ideas are there. The music is somewhere there in the ether. What's in between is the title. That's my process.
Yeah.
I struggle sometimes for days, weeks. Even that title, Dancers, Dreamers, and Presidents. The idea was I saw then candidate Barack Obama come on Ellen DeGeneres' show dancing. She would have them dance.
Yeah.
He danced for about 21 seconds. He danced really well. And, it's funny.
Yeah.
Fine. But then I thought about it reflexively, and I started realizing a few days later, wow, this mixed race black man dancing with this openly gay white woman on national, international television, that might not have happened 5-10 years prior.
Right.
And even now, it's still in its own way kind of sweetly radical. But getting the humor aside, it was something that was really important for television. And it spoke to something. We forget. It spoke to something. It spoke to a type of equity, right? So with that, I wrote a 21-minute piece based on that dance. So the idea was there, but I needed the title. And once I found that title, each of the three movements, Dancers, Dreamers, and Presidents, is kind of evocative of that 21-second dance. Once I had the title, then the music just flowed.
Right. Yeah. So going back to, you talked a little bit about your education and sort of quickly going through your path to where you are now. But I remember when you were in Detroit, you worked with the students in our youth program, and this season the DSO is celebrating 50 years of civic youth ensembles and training young musicians. A program that was started in 1971 by then our assistant conductor Paul Freeman, who then went on and had a great conducting career and recorded a lot of important music. What role did music education play in your own life? And you touched a little bit on it, but
Yeah.
But why is it so important for you now? Because it is such a big part of what you do. In all these projects that you're working on, there is an educational component. And it's not just educating children, it's educating people and sort of the passing on of knowledge to others or to the next generation, in the case of students. Why is it so important to you, and how does it sort of come out and is reflected in your work?
Well, I'm the proud product of the public school system of Broward County, Florida. In the 1970s, just about every elementary school had really good music programs. Many had orchestras, and mine did. Margaret Elementary School had a really great string orchestra. I was 5 years old. I was in kindergarten. I got a full-size instrument. There were no quarter-size instruments. I know, right? It's like I had a full-size instrument for free, a private music lesson, oftentimes more than an hour once a week for free, all of the books and literature and resources and music, so on and so forth, for free. It was all a small part of my total music education.
Yeah.
And it didn't cost anything at all. And that was 1975, Margate, Florida. And of course, if my son were in that same school, he'd get none of that. In fact, all of it would cost, well, first of all, there's no more, we were called the Margate Strings. That program is gone. All those instruments are gone. Nothing is free. And at best, I think they have something that's akin to kind of music appreciation, where you're listening to and talking about music, at best. So, which is why now I am adamant about whenever I am working with an orchestra, I'm one way or another, I want to be in the classroom. I want to be in the so-called problem schools. I was a what do they call class clown? I was all those things. But I'm very committed to being an active part of a community's education of its children. Even if you don't have children, if you live in a community with children, you have children. Particularly now, I think that there's a role and a responsibility, I would say, for BIPOC artists to lead those kind of educational programs and be a vital and consequential part of them, particularly in classical music, because we're oftentimes not seen and oftentimes not heard and oftentimes aren't thought of as a part of classical music's history and education of its children and audiences.
Right. So what do you say to students who are interested in learning about music? How do you approach it with them?
Oh, there's three ways I would recommend. First, ask them what they are listening to. Start there and listen to it. Start the conversation there, because I guarantee you one thing: I've been all around the world with this, all around the world with this. So it's not unique to America. Most children all around the world are listening to very sophisticated music,
Hmm.
shockingly so. And a lot of it is black music. So whether it's Germany or Spain or France or New Zealand or Australia or some of the last places I've been to, guess what? Most of the time, young people are listening to either a hip hop or R&B or some other black or Motown. Believe it or
Hmm.
not,
Right.
Japan has a huge hip hop scene, huge, right? So dig on that, right? They're listening to very complex, oftentimes black music. That's the first step. The next step: share with them what you're listening to. Really share. Forget about syllabus and lesson plan. Start there. Start with an equal exchange of ideas. That could be day one. What are you listening to? Put it on your phone. But let's get it online. Let's watch it, by the way, too. Right? All these videos, all this information. And then you share with them what you're listening to. Then step three is easy. What are the differences? Probably pretty easy to point out. And what do you share in common? A little more
Hmm.
difficult, but that's where the richness lies.
So much of music is sharing, right?
Yeah.
Composers sharing their personal story through music. You can have a conversation about what's good music or bad music and all kinds of things, but at the end of the day, music is very personal, both to the person who created it and to the person who's listening to it. So it's
Yeah.
the relevance of it and how it relates to you, and how people are telling their story. You're sharing your personal story through your music.
Hmm.
How do you feel that that story is relevant for audiences to hear? Like, how does that come through?
Well, in my case, one of the things that we could talk about is performance practice. So, performance practice or performance practices in our field, classical music field, you have these conventions, these traditions. So, one is concertmaster comes out. Yeah, or let's break it down. Actually, you come into the hall, ushered in. Oftentimes, the orchestra is on stage, tuning up, getting ready. There's a light change. Concertmaster comes out, takes a bow, tunes the orchestra. The conductor comes out, takes a bow. Concert begins. And oftentimes, there's very little talking from the stage, if at all. And you're expected to kind of sit there, not even sometimes in total darkness. The house is at what we call 10% or 20% of light, let's say,
Right.
which is annoying to me. But to put it maybe another way is, imagine you took the rules of a classical music concert and applied it to an NBA basketball game. It's a really good way to look at performance practice. So imagine you got really dressed up, paid a lot for the ticket. You walked into the NBA basketball game. You sat down. You didn't say a word. You didn't clap. Nothing. And they're playing nothing. And then at the end of the quarter, you clapped. Applauded very politely. No hooting, no hollering. The point I'm trying to make here is that performance practice, even as I think about it, becomes kind of arbitrary, steeped in tradition.
Hmm.
That in some ways isn't even, well, I don't want to say it's not natural, but there's something about it that's very limited. Okay. So for me, it's not that I was looking at NBA basketball games, but I was looking at rock concerts. And what happens in a rock concert is the performers are not on the stage. Audience comes in and they're really kind of boisterous and speaking with one another, and there's excitement in the air. The lights change. It's actually, if all the lights go out, that oftentimes happens. People immediately start clapping.
Right.
You're
There's a
into
tradition
it,
there, too.
right?
Yeah, there's a tradition
Exactly.
in that. People know.
There's the people, yeah, people know, and then the lights on the stage come, and then the band comes out, and there's just excitement before they've played a note. There's excitement built in. You know the repertoire, so by the time you hear those first precious few notes, there's sentimentality built in because it's not unexpected, and there's an equity even if it's a rock star. The equity lies in that there's an exchange of energy and excitement, and the band on stage, they're seen in a way that is magical. Right. So what I do is, if I can't convince the orchestra to not do things on stage, and there's all the other things, fine. When I'm a soloist with an orchestra, I come out, I look at everyone. I'll sometimes start to talk directly to them as I'm tuning. I oftentimes am playing an electric or electroacoustic instrument, an amplifier. So I'm doing different effects with my instrument. During my cadenza, oftentimes I'm definitely talking directly to the audience, sometimes collaborating with some of the other musicians. Sometimes I invite the audience, the total audience, the whole audience, into a call and response type of situation. Sometimes I'm doing the same thing with the orchestra, where I play something and they imitate me. I play something and the audience imitates me. And all of these, what I call performance practices, come from multiple different cultures, multiple different traditions. Africa, Haiti, of course, America, American rock music, funk music, you name it. And I'm, looking at my moment there with the orchestra, not so much as an orchestra, but as a collection of sophisticated human beings, playing for sophisticated human beings, who sometimes have to be reminded that, clapping your hands is not just primal, but sometimes necessary,
Yeah, and I think it's something that it's that the last piece of the puzzle for us, for any performing arts, is the audience. There's a connection there, whether they're clapping or not. We have realized how much we missed audiences. I mean, we've been doing digital concerts this whole season, and as great it is to hear the orchestra, those times that I've been there and I might have been the only person in the audience because we weren't allowed to have audiences, you realize how much you miss that collective experience, right? Your experience an art form together with people in real time, and to not have anyone to talk to afterwards, or to talk to before, or to say, did you like that or did you not, and sort of share those experiences afterwards. You just feel like you're literally in an empty room, but there's nothing there to react to. You had a good experience yourself, but if you heard it and you liked it or you didn't, you want to share that. And I think we all realize how important the audience is to this equation of music making, period, right?
Yeah, I think the audience's participation. Yeah, I mean, for me, I would say that I want to not only be heard, but I want to be seen. I've had musicians who tell me, well, honestly, they don't like that. They find it offensive even. I've had a musician say he was offended that I would speak so directly and casually even to the audience. And I replied to him, well, that's your experience. That's not my experience. The artist that I love and admire the most always spoke to the audience. And that includes Leonard Bernstein.
Right.
Right?
Right. Yeah.
I have a feeling, well, we know that Beethoven, Mozart, they spoke to the audience. They did. They had a relationship. There was banter. But forgetting about those, and we've seen Stravinsky do it even, right? And now my mind shifts to Nina Simone and that wonderful documentary where the first thing she does is she just glares at the audience for a full minute. It's so, you talk about the vulnerability, or the, actually not the case, the victory of the black woman being seen. You know, it's a wonderful moment. Check it out if you know, if our audiences haven't seen it. I am, as a black Haitian American violinist, absolutely want to have a conversation as much as I can with any audience that I'm in front of, because that is a part of my experience. And I think, particularly now, as we go back into something, I don't know what it's going to be, I definitely think that that type of performance practice that is, I would say, empathetic, vulnerable, right? I would say to my friend who's thought it was rude or whatever, didn't appreciate it, I would say, well, you know what, for me, it's a moment of vulnerability. It's a moment of exchange. I am trying to figure out who I'm playing for. Oftentimes, there's not many people in the audience that look like me. But it's also an opportunity. I think it's an opportunity for the musicians behind me and the audience in front of me to see me and to hear me as something and someone visible.
Right. The DSO is performing your latest orchestral work. It's a piece called "I Am a White Person Who Blanks Black People." So I'm going to say the title one more time. I am a white person who blanks. You can fill in your own word or phrase, black people. Yeah. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the work and sort of the genesis? It was premiered last fall by the New Jersey Symphony, who was the lead commissioner for this piece. What's the backstory there?
Well, yeah, I was invited by that wonderful orchestra to write a piece. Couldn't be too long, a few minutes, 3 to 5 minutes. And I only had maybe, I don't know, 2 to 3 weeks to write it. I knew what I wanted the piece to sound like. I knew I wanted it to sound mournful. I knew I wanted it to be some sort of a memorial even. I knew that I wanted it to have a certain complexity. Only strings and percussion, right, because of the COVID protocol, so no woodwinds or brass, and limited strings, by the way. 2 percussionists, one timpani, 1 percussion. And, kind of go. We got to get this done because it's going to be filmed, and there just wasn't a whole lot of time. So I suffered a long time with the title. I needed the title. Well, again, I can't do much without the title. And I realized something, that what is a title? What's the possibility of a title? And I started realizing, a title can speak to the moment. A title can reflect the time. And I had never realized this before. A title can I asked myself the question, can a title allow for participation? That was the questions I started asking myself.
Right.
Then I started kind of playing around. I, not capital, lowercase. I am a white, not capital W, lowercase. I am a white person who, underline, blank, black, capital B, who blank, black people. And I realized, these musicians can fill in the blank. They're going to get the piece first. The conductor can fill in the blank. The audience, the online audience, anybody who sees that title, they can determine for themselves ask and answer the question, how do you feel about black people? How do you? And it could be intimate. No one ever has to know. In fact, it can change. In fact, I asked the question myself, how do I feel about black people? Well, I'm not a white person, but my son is biracial. And that's interesting, right? So I am a white person who blank black people. So it was a question that I was asking myself first, not as a white person, but as a black person. How do you feel about me? And then by extension, the orchestral members, who in this honest conversation I knew would be predominantly white, and then a question for the audience, on the online audience, who also, well, I don't know, that's the interesting about an online audience. There's no numbers on this, but let's assume that an online audience might be vastly more diverse than a on-the-ground or in-house audience, which is interesting to me.
Right.
So once I had that title, and I was scared. See, so here's the thing about that title, Erik. even writing it down and looking at it, and myself, this is what composers do. A lot of times we become our first critic, right? So I'm on my cell phone. I'll tell you exactly how this piece happened. I'm on my cell phone and I started writing down different iterations of this title. In fact, there's an iteration where everything was capitalized and I filled in the blank. I am a white person who doesn't understand or something like that. Like I was filling in the blank first, right? Because I was so scared. I mean, to me, this was like not allowed. I'm actually looking over my shoulder even now. Like as I was typing this thing out on my cell phone, probably 50 iterations, I was like, they are never going to green light this. The New Jersey, they're not going to allow this. So I finally settled on the title and I sent it, texted it to my closest friends. And I'm like, well, what do you think? And some of them, I mean, about half and a half said you should not do this. The other half said you should absolutely do this, right? Very Democratic Republican in a way. And in the end, I did it. And then, once I had that title on my, on my composing screen, once I had the title, boom, music was done. Yeah. Music was done in a few days. No problem.
Around the time, this last fall, when this work was, I think, about to be premiered, in New Jersey, it might have just been premiered. A former musician in the DSO posted a racist comment online. You and I spoke the very next morning, and we decided to add this work of yours, I'm a White Person Who Blanks Black People, to this season. We're still working on the spring season, and it fit right in. And we also issued a statement condemning this comment. But what went through your mind when you saw this person's post?
The first thing that went through my mind when I saw this person's post on my Facebook page was I felt really sad. I felt very humiliated. And I felt extremely vulnerable. And then I got angry.
Right.
But the first thing I felt was really sad. And it's the kind of sad that is familiar. I think for a lot of black people, a lot of black men, it's agonizingly familiar. I felt humiliated because it was in the midst of comments that were almost universally positive.
Right.
Because remember, this was vulnerable. The title is still vulnerable. I mean, and by that I mean, it's purposely provocative, and that inherently, at least for me, is moments of vulnerability because I don't know how somebody's going to respond. I don't know. I didn't know when I sent it in. I didn't know. First of all, I was questioning it to myself, then my friends, half of whom were like, "Don't do it." And then I do it. Because you don't know. I had no idea how the NJSO was going to respond, and they were completely supportive. But then it goes out into the world, and you and I know, an audience can be very fickle, and an audience can also be can be loving, but also can be very vindictive, quite frankly, volatile. An audience can, especially for black people in classical music, an audience can be very non-supportive, right? Especially to new ideas. So it goes out into the online space, and I'm terrified. And most of the comments are really, really supportive. But then conversations happen, and the conversations are great. I'm an educator.
Right.
So the conversations were, not everybody was completely supportive, but there was a healthy discussion going on, to be, as I remember it, a healthy debate and discussion going on. And his comment landed in the middle of that. And as you said, it was 100% racist. It was actually the opposite of the intention of the title itself.
Right. And I was going to ask about that. It's such an interesting juxtaposition here, because here you have a title of yours where you can fill in a blank.
Yes.
And
exactly.
This person essentially chose to fill in their blank, and then turn it around.
Turn it around, yeah. I mean, that's the important point here. To be clear, anyone can say anything. If someone wants to fill in the blank with words that are hateful or, quite frankly, racist, that is their prerogative. That's not for me to say. But this was different. The accusation was that I was being racist. And he actually kind of, if I remember, I'm sorry, this person actually kind of changed the words around. I can't remember, in a way to make it completely offensive. I'll say. I can't remember the wording, but this was the opposite of that. And this person chose to kind of invert the purpose of participation in the piece. And I think that's really, that has to be clarified. Anyone can say anything in that blank space, right? It's not for me to say. And just as importantly, if someone hates black people or doesn't feel that black people are, I am a white person who feels that I am superior to black people, fine. I suppose at least you're being honest. But that wasn't
in the blank in a certain way. Yeah.
Yeah, so just to be clear, I'm not assuming that the blank is going to be something that is beautiful or welcoming or non-racist or equitable. To be clear, that's also the point of this. The point of this is kind of non-censorship and actually the upholding of a democratic idea, right? But this wasn't that. This was a clear accusation from a former DSO member who was accusing me because of the title of racism, which is really bizarre because the title itself is inviting in a conversation about race, not racism, but about race. Okay, so that's what hurt so bad was the accusation, and this person doubled down. Even as this online conversation then centered on his comment, there was no humility, there was no retraction, there was no self-reflection, there was no. By double down, I mean this person then started offering his own. This person started offering their own testimony and experience to their position, and their position is problematic in our field. I'll leave it there. So then I got angry and I simply tagged the League of American Orchestras, where I proudly serve on the board. I also tagged the Association of Performing Arts Presenters, where I also serve as a vice chair on their board. And to be honest, to my surprise, the response was immediate and loving and supportive. And also, of course, from you, Erik, personally and professionally, the Detroit Symphony Orchestra completely not only responded in a loving and empathetic way, but here we are committed to performing the piece, which is investment, I'd like to point out. Investment and a type of vulnerability, quite frankly. As we have now seen, subsequent to this event, other events where you have publicly had patrons come out and also say what you're doing in terms of supporting black people and BIPOC people is offensive, shouldn't be done. And as a matter of fact, if I'm remembering the story right, they are de-investing in the DSO, right?
Yeah, and I mean, I think to your point, having these conversations, I'm often reminded of one of our board members who is the chair of our DI committee of the board, who says you have to have these uncomfortable situations.
Yeah.
You have to have these uncomfortable conversations about situations that occur. Talking about race and equity, and it is uncomfortable, particularly for white people too. But it's so important to have them, and it's so important to not back away from them.
Yeah, exactly.
So you mentioned the League of American Orchestras. You sit on the board there. I also saw a panel discussion that you participated in maybe last month.
Yeah.
That was hosted by the American Composers Orchestra. It was on equity in orchestras, and you talked about it at the very end. You mentioned a shared morality, truth, rehabilitation, reconciliation. So sitting on the board of the League of American Orchestras, you have an overview of the orchestral landscape. When it comes to equity and diversity, what change do you see happening? Essentially, what does the future look like for classical music?
I'll answer the question this way. I have a dream for classical music, and that dream is so clear to me. But I also have what I'll call a practical vision. So I have a beautiful dream for classical music and specifically orchestral music, but that's tempered by a practical vision. But I'll start with the dream first. A beautiful dream would be an orchestra. Every orchestra in this country reflects its community and aspires to not only reflecting its community as it is, but reflecting the community that it might want to be. So whether it's an orchestra in Idaho, I'm saying that purposely because I was just reading yesterday that the governor of Idaho is about to sign legislation that's going to ban the teaching of the truth, the teaching of what is referred to as critical race theory, terrible term, in all schools, including universities. That's what's happening in Idaho. All right, so for my beautiful dream for classical music would be that every orchestra reflects its community as it is and as it would want it to be, in its musicians, in its staff, in its board, in everything that it does, in the clothes that they wear, right? That every orchestra would look different because every city is different, right? That every orchestra in the country, that you could look at an orchestra the same way you might look at a baseball team or a football team or a rock band or any other artist, let's say. And it's visceral. You immediately look at, here in Boston, the Boston Red Sox, the New England Patriots. I mean, they say that young children here in Boston used to learn the name Tom before Jesus, right? I suppose that's happening in Tampa Bay now. But
Right.
the point I'm trying to make is that if this isn't trite, there's something about the way something looks and the way something is thought out, not judging a book by its cover, not nearly so. We're getting at this idea of investment and ownership and reflection. So that's my dream, that an orchestra would reflect where it is now and where it wants to be. The practical vision, the practical reality is that the needle is very slowly moving. I'm 50 years old. 50 years from now, I hope that orchestras are 25% BIPOC, that the boards are 50% or more BIPOC, and not only BIPOC, but BIPOC and LGBTQI and transgender and people who have any kind of physical disabilities, anyone who's been marginalized, that orchestras are reflecting those communities by the musicians on stage, their programming, and the decision makers and stakeholders behind them. And I think that over the next 50 years, I think that 25% on stage and 50% behind it is something that can happen over the next 50 years.
Right. So I'll end with this question. Your work that we're performing, art has always responded to, in the time that it's in, to what's happening in society. Art has always responded to that. If you were to look beyond those 50 years, if you were to look at 100 years or 250 years, and looking back at this time that we're in now, how do you think we will look back at it?
Poorly. In a word, we will, in a word, disappointed. I need to be specific. I think we will look back on this time as one of the worst. And it begins with, because the story's not over, the last administration, the Trump administration. It continues with real allegiances to him and that type of ideology, which is embedded, part of America's fabric. Just is. White supremacy. It just is. And you don't know. My son is half white. My son is half black. He identifies as a double minority, meaning he is very much aware of the fact that his mother is Jewish and that his father is a black Haitian. But his friends are beyond race. His friends actually look at very deeply at who the person is. And I see this with him online. They rally around their vulnerabilities. So oftentimes, race is not nearly as much of an issue as sexual identity and protecting those that are in the LGBTQIA plus community. And he's 11 years old. So where you and I'm older than you, but where you and I probably grew up, and we grew up in different places, but where we grew up with a focus and an emphasis on race and race relations, and maybe even cultural relations and the conflict there, conversations on the conflict there. My son, it's very clear to me, his community online and on the ground are looking at who the person is and who needs to be protected. So to answer your question, as he grows up and his children grow up, to me, and I hope I live to see as much of that as I can, I think we're going to look back on this as we elected the wrong person, we adopted the wrong policies. And not only in America, I mean, there were other elected officials in other countries too who slanted right. We looked at certain ideologies that were not empathetic. And here's a real quick way to look at it. What's happening in Brazil right now is because, and the massive amount of death there, COVID related, is because of that particular president, who he self-proclaimed Trumpian, right? So it does matter. Government matters. Artists matter. Who we elect to represent us, both politically and artistically, matters. So I have a vision of a cabinet position where an artist is at the table, helping to set policy, helping to say we need to take 0.5% of our national defense budget and put it directly into the arts, right? And that will happen. It may even happen in a Harris administration. Wow. I look forward to the first woman of color leading this country because, again, that will change things. It always does. It always has. At least in a democracy, it does. It's not about trickle down. It's about trickling out, right? Circular leadership, circular, broad, horizontal leadership, not vertical, horizontal. So that's a big answer, and we probably won't live to see it, not in this dimension, but perhaps, Erik, you and I will be looking down on it, and yes, 100 years from now, 200 years, 500 years from now, the best of us will be everywhere. These conversations will be, maybe even this one, if it survives, will be looked at as embryonic, and that they're like a child. This country made deep mistakes. Lives were lost because of it, but we learned from it. We're learning from it, and that's what's going to get us to the promise of, yes, a shared magical morality.
That's a great way to end, Daniel. Always a pleasure to talk to you, my friend. Looking forward to hearing your piece.
Thank you, brother. Bless you. Looking forward to it. And thank you. Thank you.